Working on fantasy armies like elves and Rohan, not only do we have the troops to paint, but also a stable full of horses to contend with as well. Today we are going through 5.5 more methods to paint our 4-legged friends, but this time focusing on light coloured horses. To start with, all of the miniatures will be primed with a Vallejo Ghost Grey, however any off-white coloured spray from a rattle can will be perfect. And you will not need an airbrush for this video. For the first horse, we are going for a smoother look to the coat, like this White Rohan Horse, and I'm going to use some airbrush paints for this one. A, because they are already thinned down and perfect to paint with, and B, there are extra colours that we can use that are not in the normal range of acrylic paints. ℏ Grey was applied first for the base coat, and then a wolf grey was painted more into the areas in between the muscles to create a subtle bluish shade. To give the coat a lighter look, some Yeti white was mainly then applied onto the areas where the wolf grey meets our previous layer of ℏ Grey. This will smooth the gradient between the colours, softening the overall look on the horse coat. And then lastly, another thin layer of paint, this time matte white, was applied away from the wolf grey areas. This paint is intended to bring out the muscle structure of the horse a bit more, and this will act more like a layered highlight. You can use the same paint to add a few lines of highlights to the more prominent features of the horse, to bring out the muscles and the bone structure a bit more, such as the jawline, the areas of the neck as it's towards the front of the miniature as you look at it, and its knobbly knees. A little while back I used the same colours for these two Gandalf sculpts, but it was a mix of airbrush and paintbrush, just for that extra speed. We'll cover a few ways to paint the horsehair and muzzles in the video, just to give you some ideas, and you can mix and match these for your cavalry miniatures. First up was to darken down the muzzle with some dark tone wash. Again, this is quite a thin paint, as we can still see the layer underneath slightly. So the first layer of paint was used on the whole area, whilst the second was more towards the mouth to give it a darker gradient. And a castle grey paint was used to highlight the nostril and mouth area. For the eyes, I did have them originally as a pure colour. In this instance, they were black. But I felt it looked a bit weird, especially on a miniature at this scale. So I added a small amount of white towards the back of the eye, and kept the black pupil much larger than what I would do for a human-like miniature. And the last of the facial features were the teeth and the tongue. Now I'm going to do the same throughout all of the cavalry I'm painting up, so I'll show you this clip just the once to avoid repetition and save you time. After the tongue was painted with a base coat of Wyvern Fury, it was given a highlight of Raging Rose. The teeth were then picked out with some Tomb King Tan. This is more of a bony colour which will stand out nicely over the darker areas of the mouth. The first way we are painting the hair on the mane and the tail for today's video will be to give this horse a cream coloured look. And a soft tone wash was used for this. These wash paints are much thinner than our acrylic paint counterparts, and with that, the paint will glide into the recesses of the sculpt with ease and give us some quick shaded areas. I added some colour to the hooves whilst the wash was drying. As this isn't really an important part of the miniature, I'll focus more on the horse colours and the hair, as these are the main aspects that I wanted to cover and show you. And with that, for the hair, I used an old manky brush and a bit of sponge to dry brush on some Tomb King Tan onto the sculpt. Doing the dry brush method is a quick way to pick out the upper parts of the sculpt, leaving the shaded areas alone, and this will give us a quick highlight. Horse number 2. As we move away from the smoother look, we are going to create a subtle texture for the next one, and this was inspired by this Arabian white horse. Our previous four-legged friend had a bluish tint of shading applied to it with an airbrush paint. But this time we're going to create that thin down paint by using some Army Painter War Paint's Stabilizer. We are going to go for a grey toned shade this time. And like before, this was applied to all of the areas between the muscles, legs, and of course the underneath of the horse, where natural shading would be if the sunlight was coming from above. To lighten up the horse, some company grey was used with a large curve-shaped dry brush. I mainly painted in a circular motion to avoid any streaks that might occur, such as if we were to just dry brush in a left to right motion. Now, as we're going for a mottled look to the fur, I'm not worried about being too tidy here. I just want the lighter colour to go on. From here, I switched over to a much smaller dry brush, and instead of using that circular motion as we had before, this was more of a patting method to dot the paint onto the horse. All you have to do is add a small amount of paint onto the brush tips, take a wee bit off, here I'm just using my hand, and then poke like a vigorous painting woodpecker to build up the lighter colour. Depending how light you would like your horse to be, you can leave it here at this stage and move on to the next. Or, like me, you could use some matte white paint and do the exact same method as before to build up the colour even more. And this will give our horse a lighter appearance overall. Finally, to emphasise the shaded areas a little bit more, our initial mix of Uniform Grey and Stabilizer was used once again. I added this into the exact same areas as we did near the start. And because we have added a mottled effect with our two dry brushes just before, this will add a grey layer, or kind of like a filter, so that you can see the texture slightly underneath the grey shade. Our good old dry brush method with a battered old aged brush was used with a couple of colours of light grey for the hair. Because patting on the horse coat up to our white was so quick, I decided to spend more time on the hair, to make this detail on the miniature more prominent. So I gave a subtle cream colour of gargoyle grey, which was mixed with some stabiliser, and added this to the base of the tail and near the butt, and on the top part of the mane. I even added some to the bottom parts of the legs near the ankles, just for a bit of variation on the horse coat. Finally, a mix of Uniform Grey and Stabilizer was used once more, and this was added towards the end of the tail, just to darken this down a little bit more. And a shadow line was painted underneath the hair of the mane, and this just helped to break up the area between the hair and the horse neck. This time for his muzzle, we went for a pale skin tone colour to make it a bit different from the black that we used for the first horse. A thin layer of tourmaline skin was applied first as the initial colour, and once dry it was highlighted up with a leopard stone skin. I didn't go too crazy and bold on this section, as I wanted a faint look to this colour for the detail. For horse 2.5, and because I just wanted to see what the end result would look like, I painted another horse coat to the same stage as we just did before, and then I started to add a speckled, spotted look to it to try and mimic this American paint horse. First, using a bit of sponge with some tweezers, I gave an irregular look to each spot, but I added more than what was present on the photo. Remember, I'll be looking at these from a few feet away on the gaming table, so I want to see those speckles. To make them less obvious and not give them that, good god, this horse has been battered with some paintballs kind of feel, a layer of slightly thinned down holy white speed paint was mixed with some medium, and this was applied to the whole of the white surface. It firstly desaturates the brown that we have just painted on, so it feels more like part of the horsehair rather than just splattered on top. And secondly, it darkens down the shaded areas a little bit more. and this is also a good colour to use for a quick shade on other white horses. Finally, I went back in with the brush to add a few more speckles of brown here and there, as well as applying it back into a few of the larger sponged areas, just to give it a bit more depth. Overall, I'm glad I tried something different, but I'm not 100% sure if I like it as it is. Obviously, I still need to paint the saddle and the rider. So what do you guys think? Yay or nay? Now that's comedy gold right there. We've had one patchy horse, yes, but what about a second patchy horse? The dapple grey Orlov Trotter. Starting from the off-white spray, we're gonna have some fun with this one and play around with some speed paints first. Using the large dry brush from earlier, we're going to pat on a patchy look to this horse to begin with. Don't worry about being tidy whatsoever. That's not what this horse is about. Doing this method forces the paint to dry pretty quickly so it won't smudge or run off. After the grey was applied, I added some grim black to all of the legs. This is going to give the horse a two-tone look and make it a bit more visually interesting for the tabletop. A couple layers were added here, the second being more towards the bottom of the legs to give it a bolder colour. Following along with the Chris, what the hell are you painting method, we are going to use a small dry brush as a stamp tool. And this time prod the tip of the brush to create a lighter pattern on the horse with some Brigade Grey. I'm not overlapping the dots here, but rather keeping them separate from each other, so that we can still see the mottled grey base coat in between our new colour. Once you have gone over most of the model, I didn't bother doing the lower legs, some of the dots were refined a bit more by going back in and using a brush. Especially the ones on the neck, as they are going to be smaller. And just like on Art Attack, here is one that I worked on earlier, but that one was used just with a normal brush, and all of the dots were painted to make them look smaller. Now, similar to what we did on the American Paint Horse, we're going to add a thin layer of colour on top of what we have just done, but this time using a normal acrylic paint and stabilizer to create a glaze. This is going to knock back that spotty look just a smidge and tie the colours in a bit better. Even adding it onto the areas of the back of the legs where the black fades into the grey to help that transition a bit more. Due to the multiple layers of paint that we have added onto the horse, a few shaded areas just needs a bit of attention, especially on those cute little knobbly legs and around the face. So our trusty Gravelord Grey speed paint was used once again to help recess shade the miniature. For the hair, I went with black because he's an emo, and this will contrast nicely with our light grey dotted effect. With a couple dry brushed warm grey paints for the highlights, the horse was done pretty quick up to this point. As we've made good time, we can add a few highlights here and there to define the shape a bit more, as this is a busy looking beast. Field Grey was used to highlight the back of the legs, whilst Brigade Grey was used for the rest of the horse, focusing more around the legs and the head. Lastly, a few smaller dots here and there were painted on with our thinner brush to give this pattern a bit more impact. I tried to do the rule of, if I can see these details when holding the miniature arm's length, then that's good enough for the tabletop. Method number 4, and one of my personal favourites, is the majestic looking Morgan horse. Here I'm brushing on with this airbrush paint, as it's already thinned down and it's smooth like a butter minto sweet. I like to use airbrush paints for normal painting now and again, especially if there is a specific colour that I really like in the range. I didn't want to go too heavy here with the shading, just to create some darker areas on the sculpt. So I thinned down an already runny wash further with some stabilizer, but any acrylic paint medium I find will work nice enough with these washes. like the previous horses, mainly concentrate around the muscular and bony areas of the sculpt. And as the hair is going to be closely matched to the horse body, this was also given an all-over wash at the same time. Next up, we're going to layer the skin and give it a lighter feel, and a smooth bristled makeup brush will make quick work for this. Just add a bit of paint onto the tips of the bristles and test it out on your hand to see how it will layer on the miniature. And then just glide it onto the surface of the horse. For best results, do it in a circular motion to ensure a smoother application. You don't need to press hard at all with these brushes, just let the bristles hit the top surface of the horse to build up the layers. It's all about subtlety with this horse, and we'll use a magenta tone wash for the pigmentation of the muzzle. This will tint the area just a little bit, but not make it look like the horse is wearing some sort of lipstick. And this was followed up with an Army Painter Figgy Pink highlight. And this muzzle colour would be pretty good for our other white horses too. So that's a little tip to add some variety to your warband. And now is the time to refine those shaded areas of the horse. And we'll go back to the previous mix of light tone and stabilizer. We're pretty much going to retrace our steps from before, and add it to the legs and other muscle areas of the horsey. This is just to simply darken down those areas a bit more. With the previous horses, we have dry brushed all of the hair, but this time I'm going to go for a highlight using a fine tipped brush instead. Doing it this way takes a smidge longer, but the results are more precise. You can also control better where the paint lands with each brushstroke, and this is pretty handy when painting characters with steeds. And just like our Arabian horse earlier, the end of the tail was darkened down to give it a bit of variation to the hair, as well as painting that shadow line just underneath the hairline on the neck. Now onto the added painted texture. We have done so far a smooth horse, we've patted on a texture in a couple of ways, and we've also created a speckled look to the horse coat. So for this one, we're going to mimic a longer hair texture by applying a whole bunch of teeny tiny lines to the body of the horse. Each row of lines will be painted on by going the same way, and we'll apply these more to the edges of the sculpt. For example, going along the leg, around the hip, and down the neck. This method will take a while, so patience is key here. I started off with a Great Hull Grey to go around the entirety of the horse first, then switched over to Brain Matter Beige afterwards to go over some more of those defined areas, like the neck, the hips, and the knees, just to help with the shape of the horse stand out more. Now for the Siamese cat of horses for today, and method number 5, this criollo horse. This one has really nice blue eyes and a lovely light grey coat. So to begin with, we're going to use this primer. Don't forget about this paint in your collection. Just because it says it's an effects paint doesn't mean that you can't use it as an additional grey colour in your range. Once we base coated the horse, we used our trick from painting the grey Olaf trotter for the legs to darken them down. This time I used a mix of matte black and stabilizer to thin down the black, and painted this on to just above the horse's knee. This will be our first layer, as we're going to create a bit of a gradient which will lead into our grey colour. And with the second layer, this was painted up just to the knee, to provide a bolder black finish. And whilst we still had the paint on the palette, the muzzle was given a layer of this black mix also. This has been a really fun video to make, and especially researching horse types as there are so many out there. For inspiration, I'd suggest a Google image search and use Pinterest to start with, and go from there. Hopefully you too can be inspired to give your cavalry miniatures a bit of variety. Now we have our base coats down for the miniature, let's start adding those details to make it come to life. First off was a strong tone wash. and this was applied just over the knee area where the first layer of our black was painted on. And this is going to help that transition into grey. The horse head was also given a wash as well, to give it that hint of brown. And for horses that do not have that added headgear on, you could paint on a patch design at the front to give it some more visual interest. The black areas of the legs were given a highlight of field grey to finish off that part of the model. Mainly you're just concentrating around the ankles and the knees, but also just above where the hooves start to separate these areas. Which gives me a moment for my question of the day. Have you ever ridden a horse? And do you have a good story to tell about it? As always, share those responses in the comments below. Alrighty, time for the shading. And we are going to go for a speed paint this time of 𝐉𝐿𝘆𝘆𝑔𝐴. This was slightly thinned down with some speed paint medium, which will help give us this horse a faint look to the shading. Speed paints are a pretty versatile paint, and you can use them in a number of ways, and they are amazing for shading, especially the coloured ones on metallics. Make sure you give that a go sometime. But for this horse, we just wanted some darker grey tones to the coat. Afterwards, our grey primer was used once more, but this time just to tidy up some of the areas to help smooth the speed paint grey from the previous stage. The primer was thinned down slightly with some war paint stabilizer. You can tell this is becoming a pretty handy tool for me, as you can thin paints down quite a lot without losing its colour, so it's good for painting on smoother colours, creating washes and glazes. Using the technique of line painting as we had for our previous Morgan horse, Company Grey was the light coloured paint of choice to add the final textured highlight to this horse. As mentioned before, it does take a little while. However, with all the techniques we've used today in the video, you could mix and match these methods on the different horses. For example, keeping these colours, but maybe perhaps dotting on the texture with a small dry brush instead. Just like what we did with our Arabian horse. That way, each of your horses can look slightly different to one another and make them more exciting to look at on the battlefield. And for the eyes, I had to go with those enchanting blue orbs. So black was used first to paint up the eye socket, and this was followed up by picking out just the eye with runic cobalt. And once dry, coming back in once again with a black to dot a pupil in. I hope that you've enjoyed this mini compilation video of painting horses. And if you want even more ways to paint our four-legged friends, then check out this video link on the screen.